The airport was alive with movement, voices overlapping in a symphony of departure calls. Luggage wheels rolling against polished floors, and the occasional scent of fresh coffee wafting from busy kiosks. Beneath the fluorescent lights of Logan International Airport in Boston, an undeniable tension cut through the air, centering on a single interaction that, to the untrained eye, seemed routine. Janelle Parker, a poised and sharply dressed black woman, stood in line at the first-class security checkpoint. She carried herself with an effortless confidence, the kind of presence that turned heads without the need for a single word. But Officer Brandon Myers, a tall, broad-shouldered white TSA agent in his late 40s, didn't see a woman of accomplishment, he saw a target. Myers had been working security for over 2 decades, a career that had granted him an authority he wielded with quiet arrogance. He was a man of instincts, he told himself, and his instincts always guided him right. He had been watching Janelle from the moment she stepped into the terminal, his gaze narrowing on the way she walked with ease through the privileged lanes of the wealthy. Something about it made him uneasy. Maybe it was the way she didn't fumble with her boarding pass like so many others. The way she exuded control in a space where he believed people like her should be uncertain, cautious, apologetic. Maybe it was just the color of her skin. As she approached the security scanner, Myers stepped forward, his voice cutting through the hum of the terminal like a blade. "Ma'am, step aside," he ordered, his tone sharp, unwavering. Janelle barely blinked. She had seen men like him before, men who mistook their uniforms for absolute power. Still, she paused, arching a single, perfectly shaped brow. "Excuse me?" "Random check." Myers replied too quickly, too practiced, motioning for her to move out of line. He made a point of stepping into her personal space, his posture stiff with manufactured dominance. Janelle inhaled deeply, her pulse steady, her hands resting at her sides with measured restraint. She knew this script, had lived this scene too many times before. But this time, she was prepared to flip the narrative. The murmurs of travelers around her grew as the seconds stretched, some merely watching, some recording, others exchanging knowing glances of discomfort but saying nothing. She had expected that too. "This is ridiculous," Janelle muttered under her breath as she reluctantly stepped aside. Myers smirked, hearing her words, and seized the opportunity to escalate. "Excuse me? Did you say something?" His voice rose just enough to turn heads, his smirk widening as he positioned himself for a performance. Janelle met his gaze with unwavering composure. "I said this is ridiculous. You have no probable cause." The chuckle that left Myers' lips was dripping with condescension. "Lady, I don't need probable cause." He tapped his badge with a single finger. "You see this? This means I decide who's suspicious. And you?" His gaze swept over her designer pantsuit, the sleek leather handbag slung over her forearm. "You don't exactly fit the profile of someone flying first class." There it was, the truth, spoken plainly and with no shame. The humiliation burned hot in her chest. But she refused to give him what he wanted. She knew men like Myers thrived on provoking a reaction. They wanted the anger. They wanted the fight so they could justify their actions, twist the story, and cast themselves as the victim. Instead, she did something unexpected. She laughed. A quiet, humorless chuckle that made his smirk falter for just a fraction of a second. She saw it then, the brief flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He hadn't been expecting that. "You think this is funny?" he snapped, stepping closer, his breath now only inches from her face. Janelle tilted her head slightly, as if examining a specimen under a microscope. "Oh," she said, her voice low, measured, laced with a confidence that sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. "You have no idea." Then, with the same calm she had maintained throughout, she slipped her hand into her bag, not too fast, not too slow, just deliberate enough to watch his fingers twitch toward his holster. With practiced ease, she retrieved a small, black leather case and flipped it open. The golden emblem inside caught the artificial airport lighting, and with it, the atmosphere shifted in an instant. Silence. The color drained from Myers' face as his eyes locked onto the badge in her hand. It wasn't just any badge. It was the badge of the Deputy Director of National Security Affairs, one of the highest-ranking positions in the United States intelligence community. For a long second, he stood frozen, his mind scrambling to process the weight of what had just happened. The whispers around them turned into a growing murmur. Phones were recording. Eyes were wide with realization. A single moment, a single mistake, and everything he thought he knew, his power, his control, was crumbling around him. Janelle let the silence stretch. Let him stew in his own unraveling. Then, finally, she leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper but packed with enough force to make his hands tremble at his sides. "Now, Officer Myers," she said, savoring every word, "would you like to explain to the Deputy Director of National Security exactly why you decided to single me out?" His throat bobbed as he swallowed hard, his authority slipping through his fingers like sand. For the first time in his career, he felt something he had never felt before: fear. And this was only the beginning. The next morning, as Janelle sat in a high-rise office in Washington, a cup of black coffee steaming beside her, her phone buzzed with updates. Overnight, the video had gone viral. The nation was watching. The Department of Homeland Security had already launched an internal review of systemic racial profiling at major transit hubs. And Officer Myers was under immediate suspension pending investigation. But she wasn't stopping there. Because this wasn't just about one man. This was about a culture of unchecked power. About a system that had operated with impunity for far too long. About the thousands of others who had been harassed, humiliated, and violated without a title or a badge to protect them. She reached for her phone and dialed the number of Assistant Attorney General Marcus Devine, her closest ally in the fight for reform. "We go after all of it," she said the moment he answered. "Every policy, every procedure. We dismantle this from the inside out." There was a brief pause on the line. Then Marcus let out a low chuckle. "I was hoping you'd say that." Outside her window, the city buzzed on, the world continuing as if nothing had happened. But Janelle knew better. Something had started, and she wasn't going to stop until it was finished. Because justice wasn't just about one moment. It was about making sure this moment never happened again. And for the first time in a long time, she knew, this time, the system had picked the wrong woman to challenge. The fallout from the airport incident was immediate and relentless. What started as an all-too-familiar case of racial profiling had evolved into a national reckoning. The video, captured from multiple angles by travelers at Logan International Airport, spread like wildfire across social media. News anchors dissected every frame. Panel discussions debated the implications. And columnists tore apart the system that had allowed Officer Brandon Myers to operate unchecked for so long. For Janelle Parker, the Deputy Director of National Security Affairs, it was both vindication and a burden. She had not set out to become a viral symbol of resistance. She had simply wanted to board her flight. To continue her work without being reduced to a stereotype, an inconvenience, a target. But now, she found herself thrust into the center of a movement she could not ignore. And Brandon Myers, once a man who carried his authority like a blunt instrument, was now the hunted instead of the hunter. At first, the officer dismissed the backlash as nothing more than internet hysteria. He had seen these types of scandals before: cops accused of brutality, excessive force, racial bias. The news cycle would eat it up. Social justice warriors would scream their outrage. And then, after a few days, it would all fade into the background like white noise. But this time was different. Because this time, he had picked the wrong woman to humiliate. The first blow came the very next morning when the Transportation Security Administration placed him on immediate administrative leave. His superiors had no choice. The video was too damning. His smirking face, his dismissive words, "You don't exactly fit the profile of someone flying first class," had already cemented him as a villain in the public consciousness. Then came the second blow, an internal review of his entire career. What they uncovered was a pattern of abuse so extensive, so deeply ingrained in his policing, that even his fellow officers found it difficult to defend him. Complaints, dozens of them, surfaced. Accusations of unwarranted searches, aggressive detainment, excessive use of force. He had been reprimanded 6 times in the past 3 years. Each incident swept under the rug. Each complaint dismissed with carefully worded internal reports that protected him from any real consequences. Until now, Janelle, sitting in her Washington office, stared at the thick dossier her assistant had placed in front of her. It contained the results of the preliminary investigation into Myers' history. And with each page she turned, the bile in her throat rose higher. A teenager detained for acting suspicious at a train station. He had done nothing but look up at the schedule board. A black businessman forcefully removed from an airport lounge. His first-class ticket was not enough to convince Myers he belonged there. An elderly woman ordered out of a security line for no reason other than the fact that she had challenged his authority. A father handcuffed in front of his young daughter for not complying fast enough with his orders. Each case told the same story. Each case had been buried in bureaucracy, ignored by a system that protected men like Myers rather than the people they victimized. And now, that system had turned its back on him. Myers had underestimated the power of exposure. His own words, his own arrogance, were now being used against him, dissected by journalists, condemned by politicians, and laughed at by late-night comedians. His badge, his shield, his safety net, was no longer impenetrable. But the exposure did something more than just cost him his career. It made him desperate. Brandon Myers had spent his life believing in his own invincibility. He was the enforcer, the authority, the one people feared. And now? Now he was nothing. The messages from his colleagues had stopped. The quiet nods of approval he had once received at the precinct were replaced with avoidant glances and whispered conversations behind his back. His so-called friends in the force had abandoned him, eager to distance themselves before the department-wide audit unearthed their own questionable actions. The final straw came when his lawyer, a department-appointed bulldog named Richard Hartley, sat across from him in a dimly lit office and delivered the words that shattered him completely. "They're bringing criminal charges against you." Myers scoffed. "For what? Doing my job?" Hartley leaned forward, his expression as unapologetic as it was exhausted. "For civil rights violations, falsifying reports, and misconduct under federal law." He tossed a folder onto the desk. "And this is only the beginning." Myers flipped through the documents, his hands trembling. "This is bullshit." Hartley sighed. "The Department of Justice is involved. They're going to make an example out of you." He studied Myers for a moment before adding, "And you don't exactly have a lot of allies left." Myers felt his stomach drop. For the first time, it hit him with full force. He was truly alone. And someone was going to pay for that. Janelle's internal struggle, the burden of justice. While Myers plotted revenge, Janelle Parker found herself grappling with a battle far more insidious, one that waged inside her own mind. The world saw her as a symbol of strength. But behind closed doors, the pressure was suffocating. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw their faces, the faces of the victims Myers had left in his wake. The young girl crying as her father was handcuffed. The elderly woman forced to remove her shoes while struggling to stand. The black businessmen humiliated in front of white executives. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was so much bigger than one confrontation at an airport. But where did it end? Janelle had spent her career working within the system, believing that if she climbed high enough, she could change it from the inside out. But what if the system was beyond fixing? The weight of the fight pressed against her chest like an immovable force. She had spent years playing by the rules, maneuvering through bureaucratic red tape, dodging the subtle racism that had tried to keep her from rising. She had smiled through microaggressions, bit her tongue when her competence was questioned, and forced herself to be twice as good, twice as careful, twice as composed. And still, it had happened. Still, a man like Myers had looked at her and seen nothing but a black woman who didn't belong. Was she fighting a battle that could never be won? As she sat in her dimly lit office, staring at the mountains of paperwork detailing decades of unchecked abuse, she felt something stir inside her. Anger. Not the quiet, controlled kind she had trained herself to wield like a scalpel. No, this was rage. Raw, undiluted, and burning like wildfire. If the system wanted a fight, then a fight was exactly what she was going to give them. Meanwhile, in a rundown motel on the outskirts of Boston, Brandon Myers nursed a bottle of whiskey in his shaking hands. His career was gone, his reputation was destroyed, and the woman who had ruined him was still out there, thriving while he suffered. His eyes darkened as he scrolled through the news articles, the late-night comedy sketches, the social media posts calling for his arrest. And then, he saw it. A new headline. Deputy Director Janelle Parker to testify before Congress on racial bias in federal security agencies. His grip on the bottle tightened. She wasn't just taking him down. She was coming for the whole damn system. A slow, Twisted smile crept across his lips. If he was going down, he was going to make damn sure he took her with him. Because no one, not even a woman like her, walked away from humiliating a man like Brandon Myers. No one. The courtroom was a fortress of silence. The kind that weighed heavy in the air like a storm waiting to break. The polished wooden benches gleamed under the harsh overhead lights. The federal seal hanging behind the judge's chair casting an ominous presence over the room. Brandon Myers, once an untouchable officer, now sat at the defendant's table in a crisp gray suit that couldn't mask the sweat dampening his collar. His face, once flushed with arrogant bravado, was now taut with barely concealed rage and disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. He had spent years protected by the badge, by the silence of his colleagues, by the bureaucracy that buried complaints under mountains of paperwork. He had been the enforcer of a system that rewarded men like him. Men who knew how to bend the rules without breaking them too obviously. And yet, here he was, facing criminal charges, facing public disgrace, facing the very system he had believed would always have his back. But the real gut punch? The system wasn't just allowing this to happen, it was orchestrating his downfall. The prosecution didn't just come prepared. They came armed to the teeth. The lead prosecutor, Angela Cross, was known for being relentless. But today, she was merciless. The evidence she presented wasn't just damning, it was designed to incinerate whatever remained of Myers' credibility. Surveillance footage, internal reports, decades of misconduct, covered up, excused, and ignored, were now being laid bare for the world to see. She didn't just expose Brandon Myers. She exposed the entire corrupt infrastructure that had enabled him. And the real kicker? They let it happen. His own department, the same one that had shielded him for years, was now throwing him to the wolves to protect itself. Myers gritted his teeth as his former captain, Michael Sanderson, took the stand. This was the same man who had once called him a model officer. The same man who had laughed off complaints against him in private. And now? Now, he was testifying against him. This department takes allegations of misconduct seriously, Sanderson said, his voice steady, measured. We were unaware of the full extent of Officer Myers' actions until this investigation revealed troubling patterns. Lies. Myers clenched his fists under the table. They had known. They had always known. But now that public scrutiny was too intense, now that their funding was at risk, now that Congress was watching, they had decided he was expendable. The betrayal was swift and surgical. His fellow officers, men he had trusted, men who had laughed with him over beers, men who had encouraged his actions when the cameras weren't rolling, were now distancing themselves at record speed. They testified against him, each statement carefully worded to make it seem like they had no idea. Like they were horrified by his actions. Like he was a lone bad apple. Myers wanted to scream. He wasn't a lone bad apple. He was a product of the tree. And now? Now, the tree was cutting off its rotting branch to keep itself alive. But the prosecution wasn't done yet. Because the next witness shattered everything. The doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Footsteps echoed against the marble floor. Myers' heart stopped when he saw who had just walked in. His lawyer, Richard Hartley, stood up so fast his chair nearly toppled over. "Your Honor," he stammered. The defense was not informed of this. Judge Eleanor Sterling held up a hand to silence him. "The court has decided to allow this testimony," she said, her voice firm. "Proceed." The man who approached the stand was unmistakable. Captain Daniel Harrington. Not just any captain. The man who had personally mentored Myers when he first joined the force. The man who had taught him everything he knew. The man who had once told him that the system would always protect its own. And now? Now, he was here to bury him. Myers could hardly breathe. As Harrington was sworn in, the tension in the room thickened. Everyone was waiting for the moment that would destroy Myers completely. And then, Harrington spoke. "I have served in law enforcement for over 30 years. He began, his voice calm but resolute. "And I have seen many officers come and go. But none have caused me as much regret as Officer Myers." A murmur spread through the room. Myers felt the blood drain from his face. "I was aware of certain disciplinary issues early in his career," Harrington continued. "I vouched for him. I protected him. I believed he was doing what was necessary to uphold law and order. But in truth, I enabled a monster. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Myers felt like the walls were closing in on him. This couldn't be happening. Harrington, his mentor, his superior, was calling him a monster in open court. I regret that it took me so long to see what was right in front of me, Harrington said, looking directly at Myers for the first time. But today, I will no longer stay silent. This system cannot move forward until we acknowledge our failures. And I failed. Myers felt like he had been punched in the gut. Harrington had just signed his death sentence. And the jury? The jury was watching his every move. Janelle Parker's fight for justice reaches a climax. Outside the courthouse, Janelle Parker watched the live broadcast on her phone. This was more than a conviction. This was the collapse of an empire. And yet, she knew this was only the beginning. The system wasn't just getting rid of one officer, it was rebranding itself. Pretending it had never been complicit. And that was what she would take down next. She turned to Marcus Devine, the Assistant Attorney General, standing beside her. We need to push harder, she said. If they think throwing Myers under the bus will make this go away, they're wrong. We go after everything, every officer involved, every policy that allowed this. We don't stop at him. Marcus nodded, a grim determination in his eyes. Then let's make sure they never recover from this. Janelle exhaled, watching as the cameras continued flashing, the crowd roaring, the country waiting for what came next. This wasn't just about justice. This was about dismantling the machine. What happens next? Brandon Myers is finished, but Janelle Parker's war has just begun. Will she be able to take down the system before it retaliates? Will law enforcement fight back against her reforms? Or will a greater enemy emerge, one with more to lose than Myers ever had? The battle isn't over. It's just getting started. Fire if you want to know what happens next. Make sure to hit that like button. Leave a comment below, and subscribe to stay updated. What do you think will be the next move in this fight for justice? Let us know in the comments. Down finger. And stay tuned, because the real war is just beginning. Beyond one man, dismantling a corrupt system. The air inside the courtroom felt electric, charged with an anticipation that made every breath heavier. The prosecution's case against Brandon Myers, the former police officer turned national disgrace, had been airtight. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimonies damning. He was done, but as the trial entered its final phase, the true battle was only beginning. Because this wasn't just about him anymore. From the moment Janelle Parker walked into the courthouse that morning, she knew that today wasn't about delivering justice to one rogue officer. It was about pulling the curtain back on an entire system that had enabled men like him to thrive. And as she and Special Agent Marcus Hayes sat at the prosecution's table, their strategy had already shifted. Myers was the opening act. Now, it was time to take down the entire organization that had protected him. The financial paper trail, a bombshell revelation. The courtroom had been expecting closing arguments. A final summation of Myers' crimes before the jury was sent to deliberate. But the prosecution had one last trick up its sleeve. Angela Cross, the lead prosecutor, adjusted her glasses and turned to the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but laced with something deeper, a knowing confidence. The kind that signaled an imminent bombshell. Before we conclude, the prosecution would like to introduce new evidence that has recently come to light. A ripple of murmurs surged through the courtroom. The judge raised an eyebrow. New evidence? On what grounds? Cross exchanged a glance with Janelle and Marcus before responding. The evidence pertains not only to the defendant, Brandon Myers, she said, her words slow and deliberate, but to a much broader conspiracy, one that extends far beyond this courtroom. A hush fell over the room. Even Myers, who had spent most of the trial looking cold and detached, sat up straighter, his fingers tightening into fists. Janelle felt it, too, the turning point, the moment where everything changed. Cross turned toward the courtroom doors. The prosecution would like to call forensic accountant Daniel Whitmore to the stand. Janelle watched as a man in a crisp suit walked into the room, carrying a thick stack of documents. And she knew, in that instant, that they had them. Not just Myers. All of them. A trail of dirty money. Whitmore's testimony was the spark that ignited a firestorm. Under direct examination, he methodically unraveled a financial scheme so elaborate, so deeply entrenched in the system, that it painted a picture of corruption beyond anyone's imagination. Millions of dollars laundered through fake training programs, fraudulent overtime claims, ghost employees on the payroll, money funneled through phony shell companies, all leading back to a network of high-ranking officers. And Brandon Myers? He wasn't the mastermind. He was just one of many enforcers, one of many who had benefited from the system but wasn't high enough on the chain to be protected forever. And now? Now, the walls were closing in on the real players. Janelle studied the faces of the defense team, the nervous glances exchanged between the few officers present in the gallery. She could see it, the quiet panic settling in, the realization that this wasn't going to stop at Myers. It was going all the way up. The system fights back, a desperate move. As Whitmore continued laying out the financial details, Janelle felt a prickle of unease at the back of her neck. Something was off. And then, the explosion. Not literal, but in the form of a sudden motion from the defense. Richard Hartley, Myers' attorney, stood so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "Your Honor, I object," he barked. "This testimony is irrelevant to the charges against my client." Judge Sterling's eyes narrowed. Objection overruled. Hartley clenched his jaw. "This is a witch hunt. The prosecution is turning this trial into a circus, trying to indict an entire department based on speculation and circumstantial evidence." Cross didn't even blink. If the defense would allow the witness to finish, they'd see that this isn't speculation. She turned back to Whitmore. "Mr. Whitmore, can you state for the record what the final destination of these fraudulent funds was?" Whitmore flipped to a highlighted document and lifted his gaze toward the court. "The final recipient of these funds," he said, "was the Fraternal Order of Law Enforcement Advancement, an organization chaired by none other than Chief Commissioner Robert Garrison." Silence. Janelle felt the entire room shift. Not just a reaction, but something bigger. Something dangerous. Because Robert Garrison wasn't just any police commissioner. He was untouchable. A kingmaker in law enforcement. And now? Now, his name was in this trial. Myers looked frozen in place. Janelle knew exactly why. He hadn't been afraid before. Because he had believed that, no matter what, Garrison would protect him. But now? Now, he saw it. The way his department had let him rot in this courtroom. The way Garrison's name had just been exposed, meaning he was no longer useful. No longer safe. Myers turned his head, locking eyes with Janelle. And for the first time, she saw true fear in him. Because he finally understood. He wasn't going to survive this. The deal, the moment that changes everything. Court adjourned for recess. But the real battle was happening in the back rooms. Myers and his attorney had a choice to make. Go down alone? Or flip? As Janelle and Marcus sat in a separate room, waiting, Marcus exhaled. "You think you'll take it?" Janelle didn't look away from the door. "He doesn't have a choice." And then, the door swung open. Hartley entered first, his face set in grim determination. Behind him, Myers walked in, his arrogance gone, replaced with a quiet resignation. "I want a deal," Myers said, his voice rough. Janelle crossed her arms. "We don't just want names. We want proof." Myers nodded slowly. "I can give you everything," he said. "How the promotions work, how complaints disappear, how they move the money, how they decide who gets protected and who gets thrown to the wolves." Janelle felt the weight of the moment settle over the room. This was it, the beginning of the real fight. The war is just beginning. As the courtroom reconvened, the news spread like wildfire. Brandon Myers had turned. And now? Now, they weren't just dealing with one corrupt officer. Now, the entire system was under siege. What happens next? Fire who else is part of this conspiracy? Fire will Commissioner Robert Garrison fight back, or fall with the rest of them? Fire can Janelle Parker survive the backlash from taking on the most powerful men in law enforcement? This isn't the end. This is just the beginning of the real battle. Right finger drop your thoughts in the comments. Who do you think will be taken down next? Fire like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter in this fight for justice. Justice versus retaliation. The cost of standing alone. The storm came swiftly, faster than Janelle Parker had anticipated, but no less inevitable. The everything change. For years, corruption had thrived in the shadows. Protected fortress of silence, intimidation, and unbreakable loyalty among those now. Janelle had shattered that illusion. And the system? It was coming for her. The threat started subtly. A note left on her car windshield. "You don't know what you started." Then the texts. "Back off while you still can. Your badge won't protect you." At first, she brushed them off. She had expected pushback. It was the price of exposing the truth. But the moment she stepped into her apartment that night and found her belongings ransacked, her walls defaced with red spray paint spelling out, "Traitor," she knew. This was more than a warning. This was a declaration of war. The past that haunts her. Sitting alone in the wreckage of her own home, Janelle ran a shaking hand through her hair. Memories flooding her mind like an unstoppable tide. She had seen this before. She had lived this before. Growing up in Newark, New Jersey, she had watched her father's life crumble under the weight of the same system she now fought against. James Parker had been one of the good ones. A black officer in the NYPD who truly believed he could change things from within. He had tried. God, he had tried. But when he spoke out against the brutality, the illegal busts, the quotas, the code of silence, they had turned on him. First, they isolated him. Then, they framed him for misconduct, a bogus excessive force complaint that stuck because the department needed a scapegoat. And finally, when he refused to stay quiet, they made sure he disappeared. Janelle had been only 12 years old the day her father walked out of their home for his last shift and never came back. His death was ruled a suicide, a bullet to the head. His service weapon found beside him in the precinct's parking garage. But Janelle never believed it. Never. She knew what they did to men like her father. And now? They were coming for her, too. No one to turn to. The next morning, she arrived at the federal building under armed escort, a temporary measure after Marcus Hayes, her closest ally in the DOJ, insisted on increased security. "You think this is just threats?" he asked, his voice taut with worry. "Janelle, this is exactly how it starts. They isolate you. They intimidate you. They make you question whether you're safe anywhere. Then, when you're at your most vulnerable, they strike." She hated that he was right. But more than that, she hated that she had nowhere to turn. Her own colleagues had started treating her differently. The sideways glances, the conversations that abruptly stopped when she entered the room, the realization that she was being watched, not just by enemies, but by people who were once friends. She had always known law enforcement wasn't a monolith. There were good cops. Real ones, people who believed in the badge for the right reasons. But there were also the ones who thrived in the darkness. And the problem was, the good ones rarely held the power. Marcus slid a folder across the table in the private DOJ conference room. "What is this?" Janelle asked, flipping it open. What she saw made her stomach drop. Phone records, emails, internal messages from officers across multiple precincts. Surveillance pulled these from an internal police union group chat. Marcus said grimly, "It's worse than we thought." Janelle's hands trembled as she read through the messages. Someone needs to shut Parker down before she takes us all down with her. She thinks she's exposing corruption? All she's doing is making enemies she can't handle. If she wants to act like she's against us, maybe she should see what happens when she doesn't have a badge to protect her. Janelle exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain calm. She had expected resistance. But this was a coordinated effort to destroy her. "You need to be careful," Marcus warned. "This isn't just intimidation anymore. This is them planning something." Janelle closed the folder, her decision already made. "No," she said, "this is them panicking. The setup, walking into the trap." That night, the call came from an unknown number. A man's voice, calm, calculated. "I have information," he said, "about Commissioner Garrison, about the whole operation, but if I come forward, they'll kill me. I need protection." Janelle felt the old instinct kick in, the hunger for truth, for exposing the full scale of the corruption. But she wasn't naive. This was too easy, too perfect. A whistleblower conveniently calling her when she was at her most vulnerable? It reeked of a trap. And yet, she had no choice but to go. If there was a chance this was real, if someone inside was willing to talk, it could blow the entire case wide open. She agreed to meet him at an abandoned train yard on the outskirts of the city. Alone, Marcus begged her not to go. "Janelle, if you walk into that alone, you're giving them exactly what they want." But she had already made up her mind. Because she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for her father. For every good cop who had been betrayed by the system. For every victim who never got justice. She had to see this through. The ambush, the moment that changed everything. The train yard was pitch black. The distant hum of the city feeling miles away. Janelle stepped forward cautiously, her heartbeat steady but her senses on high alert. She heard the footsteps before she saw them. Then, the click of a gun being cocked. It was a setup. The first blow came fast, something hard slamming into her ribs. She collapsed, gasping for breath. Boots surrounded her. A voice, one she recognized. Lieutenant Greg Daniels, one of Garrison's men, one of the officers who had testified against Myers, pretending to be on the side of justice. And now? Now, he was here to silence her. You just couldn't leave it alone. Could you, Parker? He sneered. She looked up, blood trickling down her temple. And still, she smiled. You're all scared, she rasped. That's why you're doing this. Daniel's face twisted. Shut her up. Another blow. Pain. Then, the sound of sirens. Marcus. He had followed her, called in backup. The officers scattered. But Daniels? Daniels was too slow. Janelle pulled herself up, pain searing through her side. And before he could run, she pulled out her badge. You're under arrest, she said. And this time? There was nowhere left to hide. What happens next? The ambush failed, but at what cost? Janelle now has the proof she needs, but will it be enough to bring Garrison down? And how far will the system go to protect itself now that she's survived? This isn't just about justice. It's about survival. Right finger like, comment, and subscribe to stay tuned for the next explosive chapter. Because the war has only just begun. A town divided by truth, when justice becomes a weapon. The town of Brookside had always been a place where people believed they knew their neighbors. A place where the streets were lined with white picket fences. And Sunday mornings were spent in polite conversations outside the church steps. But beneath its picturesque exterior, Brookside harbored a secret, one that had been festering for decades. That secret? The truth had never been the foundation of this town. It was prejudice. And Dion Carter was about to become its latest victim. The crime that wasn't a perfect fall guy. It happened on a Friday night. A break-in, a violent struggle, a man hospitalized. By Saturday morning, the town had already decided who was guilty. 17-year-old Dion Carter, a black honor student with a perfect record, found himself ripped from his home in handcuffs, shoved into the back of a police car before he could even process what was happening. His mother, Lisa Carter, ran outside, screaming, demanding an explanation, but none came. Officer Scott Monroe barely acknowledged her as he stuffed Dion into the backseat. His smirk barely concealed behind his badge. We got the guy, he said, turning to his partner. Dion's blood ran cold, because he hadn't done a damn thing. But Monroe didn't care, because Dion wasn't just a suspect. He was a scapegoat, the real criminal, the secret that must stay buried. Because the truth was, the break-in wasn't random. The house that had been burglarized belonged to Donovan Tate, a well-known businessman in town. And the real culprit? Ryan Monroe, Scott Monroe's son. Brookside had always had an unspoken rule, one that people like the Carters knew far too well. Black boys paid for white boys' mistakes. And Ryan Monroe, the police chief's son, was off limits. So, within hours, Scott Monroe orchestrated a perfect cover-up. The town wanted an arrest? They'd get one. And Dion Carter, with his dark skin and an unfortunate proximity to the crime scene, was the perfect target. The court of public opinion, a town that wants a villain. By the time Dion was thrown into a holding cell, Brookside was already buzzing with whispers. Not about Ryan Monroe, but about Dion. They always said he was a little too ambitious. I heard he's been in trouble before. I don't know. Something about him just seems off. None of it was true. But in a town like Brookside, truth was whatever people wanted to believe. And no one wanted to believe that the chief of police would frame an innocent black teenager to protect his son. So, the town did what it always did. It turned its back. The trial, a rigged game. The case moved fast, too fast. Because Scott Monroe knew how the system worked. Make the charges stick before anyone has time to ask questions. By the time Lisa Carter found a lawyer willing to take the case, Jordan Bell, an old family friend, the prosecution had already stacked the deck. Witnesses were unreliable. Surveillance footage magically disappeared. And worst of all, Ryan Monroe had an alibi manufactured overnight. The trial wasn't about justice. It was about survival. And Dion Carter wasn't supposed to survive. The lone voice of reason, a betrayal that changed everything. But there was one problem. One person who couldn't sleep at night. Troy Daniels, a junior officer, just 3 years into the force, who had been on duty the night of the arrest. He knew the truth. He had seen the original reports before they were altered. And most of all, he knew Ryan Monroe wasn't even in town the night of the crime, because he had seen him at a party 2 hours away. Drunk off his ass. At first, Troy tried to stay silent. Tried to ignore the way his gut twisted every time he saw Lisa Carter crying in the courtroom. Tried to convince himself that he was just a small cog in a big machine. That speaking up wouldn't change anything. But on the night before Dion's sentencing, Troy Daniels made a decision that would change everything. He walked into Jordan Bell's office and told the truth. A town turned upside down, the collapse of the lie. The confession hit the town like an earthquake. The evidence was too strong to ignore. And when Judge Sylvia Grayson, one of the few people in town with a backbone, ordered a retrial, everything fell apart. By the time Ryan Monroe was brought in for questioning, he cracked. And just like that, the Monroe family's empire crumbled. Scott Monroe was indicted. Ryan Monroe was arrested. And Dion Carter walked out of that courtroom a free man. But he would never be the same. The cost of truth, what freedom really means. When Dion stepped out of the courthouse, he expected relief, expected some sense of victory, some feeling that justice had finally been served. But all he felt was exhaustion. Because even though he had been proven innocent, the scars would never fade. The whispers didn't stop. The people who had called him a thug a week ago weren't apologizing now. And the school had already quietly expelled him. He was free, but not welcome. Innocent, but not forgiven. Brookside had never cared about the truth. And it never would. What happens next? Dion is free, but at what cost? Will he ever be able to rebuild his life after being branded a criminal? And how will the town react now that one of its own, the police chief, has fallen? This isn't just about one case. This is about an entire system built to protect itself at all costs. And Dion? He has one choice left. Fight back, or disappear. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Should Dion fight for justice or leave Brookside behind? Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications to stay tuned for the next explosive chapter. Because this story is far from over. Guilt, betrayal, and redemption. When the truth can't stay buried. The weight of guilt. Ryan's breaking point. The walls were closing in. Ryan Monroe had spent his whole life being protected. From the moment he was old enough to understand what his father's badge truly meant. He had been told the rules didn't apply to him. And for most of his life, that had been true. Until now. Until Dion Carter's case cracked open the one thing Brookside had been trying to hide for decades, the truth. And Ryan? He was drowning in it. For weeks, he had tried to convince himself that it wasn't his problem. That he hadn't really done anything wrong. It was his father, Scott Monroe, who had orchestrated the whole thing. It was his father who had falsified reports, destroyed evidence, and pinned the crime on Dion. It was his father who had taught him that power meant never facing consequences. But no matter how many times he told himself that, it didn't change the truth. He had let it happen. And the weight of that knowledge was suffocating. Ryan sat alone in his apartment, his hands shaking as he stared at the unopened bottle of whiskey in front of him. The same bottle he had been reaching for every night since the trial began. The same bottle that had become his only escape from the voice in his head screaming at him that this was all his fault. A knock at the door jolted him out of his spiral. He didn't want to answer it. Didn't want to see anyone. But when he checked the peephole and saw Detective Megan Lewis standing there, her face unreadable, his stomach dropped, because he already knew why she was here. Megan's gamble, pushing Ryan to the edge. Ryan barely had the door open before Megan pushed her way inside. Her eyes scanning the room with a sharpness that made his skin crawl. "You look like hell," she said, crossing her arms. Ryan let out a bitter laugh, rubbing his temples. "Gee, thanks. That why you came?" "No," Megan said, her voice turning serious. "I came because I think you want to tell me something." Ryan's breath caught. She knew. Of course, she did. Megan Lewis had always been the one person on the force who actually gave a damn about the truth. And now? Now, she was looking at him like she could see straight through every excuse. Every lie. Every pathetic attempt to pretend he hadn't helped destroy an innocent kid's life. Ryan swallowed hard, stepping back. You should go. Megan tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. Why? So you can keep drinking yourself into oblivion? That working out for you? Ryan clenched his jaw. Leave it alone, Megan. But she didn't. Instead, she reached into her pocket and tossed a folded piece of paper onto the table in front of him. Ryan hesitated before picking it up. The moment he saw what it was, his heart stopped. It was a transcript of an interview, his father's interview. And in it, Scott Monroe had thrown his own son under the bus. Ryan's hands trembled as he read the words. Ryan made a mistake, but he's a good kid. He got caught up in something he didn't understand. He didn't know what I was doing. He wasn't involved in the cover-up. He was just a scared boy who didn't know any better. Ryan felt like he was going to be sick. Because it was a lie. A calculated, strategic lie. His father wasn't protecting him. His father was abandoning him to save himself. Megan's voice cut through the suffocating silence. He's making a deal. Ryan, he's painting you as the idiot kid who didn't know what was happening. The scapegoat. Ryan laughed, but there was no humor in it. That son of a bitch. I know, Megan said, but the question is, what are you gonna do about it? The betrayal that changed everything. Ryan had spent his whole life believing his father was untouchable. That Scott Monroe would always win. But now, his father was cutting him loose. And Ryan? He wasn't going down alone. For the first time in his life, he saw the truth for what it was. His father was a coward. A man who had preached loyalty while throwing his own blood under the bus. And if Scott Monroe thought Ryan was going to take the fall without a fight, he was dead wrong. The confession, a town brought to its knees. 2 days later, Ryan Monroe walked into James Hill's law office. The room went silent when he stepped inside. Lisa Carter was there. Dion was there. And the moment Dion saw him, his fists clenched at his sides. Ryan cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. I need to talk. James folded his arms. You want a deal? You're a little late for that. Ryan shook his head. No deals. No negotiations. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair before meeting Dion's eyes. I just want to tell the truth. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, finally, Dion broke the silence. Why now? Ryan swallowed hard. Because my father would rather save himself than protect his own son. His voice shook, but he forced himself to keep going. And because you didn't deserve any of this. Dion's jaw tightened. No, he said, I didn't. And then, Ryan told them everything. The fall of Scott Monroe, the final blow. Scott Monroe sat in a courtroom packed with reporters. With town officials. With people who had once trusted him. Now, they were watching him burn. The moment Ryan took the stand, everything unraveled. Ryan admitted everything, that he had been at the party. That he had known he was guilty. That his father had orchestrated the entire cover-up. And the moment those words left his mouth, Scott Monroe's reign was over. Within an hour, the former chief of police was in handcuffs. His career, and his legacy, reduced to nothing but a scandal-ridden disgrace. Brookside had finally turned on him. Because the town had never been loyal to Scott Monroe. It had only been loyal to its secrets. And now that he was no longer useful, they were happy to watch him fall. A town without heroes, what comes next? Ryan Monroe's testimony shattered Brookside's illusion of innocence. Because if the chief of police had been willing to frame an innocent black teenager to protect his son, what else had been buried? People started asking questions. More cases surfaced. More victims spoke out. And one by one, Brookside's corrupt foundation began to crumble. The cost of the truth. Dion Carter was free, but he would never get back the time, the dignity, the innocence that had been stolen from him. And Ryan Monroe? He was left standing in the wreckage of the life he had destroyed, a traitor to his own family. And a man without a home. But maybe that was the price of redemption. What happens now? Ryan has exposed the truth, but will he ever be forgiven? Brookside is falling apart. How deep does the corruption go? Like, comment, and subscribe to stay tuned. Because this fight is far from over. The battle continues, justice served. But the fight never ends. Brookside had changed. The town that once turned its back on the truth was now forced to confront its darkest reality. Scott Monroe, once an untouchable figure, sat behind bars, stripped of his badge, his influence, and the illusion of power he had wielded for decades. His carefully constructed empire, built on deceit, intimidation, and systemic corruption, had finally collapsed. And yet, the battle wasn't over. Because one conviction doesn't change a system. And one victory doesn't erase generations of injustice. Dion Carter knew that better than anyone. The price of justice, a town in turmoil. Despite the courtroom victory, Brookside was still divided. Some people cheered for Dion, finally seeing the truth of how he had been wrongfully accused. But others whispered behind closed doors. They didn't care that he was innocent. They only cared that a black teenager had dared to stand up to the system and won. And they wanted revenge. Dion knew he wasn't safe. His mother, Lisa Carter, still got nasty looks at the grocery store. His best friend, Jordan Tate, had been jumped in the school parking lot for supporting him. And Dion? He had to look over his shoulder every time he walked down the street. The real battle wasn't in the courtroom. It was out here, in the real world. And Dion was done being a victim. Janelle Parker's return, a plan for real change. Across town, Janelle Parker, a former civil rights attorney turned activist, had returned to Brookside for the first time in years. She had grown up here. She had seen firsthand how the town protected the powerful and sacrificed the innocent. She had spent her life fighting to dismantle that system. And now, she had come home, because Dion Carter's case had opened a door she refused to let close. At a community meeting, Janelle stood before a packed room. City officials, activists, parents, even some police officers, listened as she spoke. "This isn't just about one case," she said, her voice steady. "This is about a system that has failed too many for too long. And we're here to change that." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some were with her. Others? Not so much. "This town doesn't need outsiders coming in and stirring up trouble," someone muttered from the back. Janelle's eyes locked onto the speaker, a man who had sat silently for years while injustice thrived. She didn't flinch. "I'm not an outsider," she said. "I was born here. I was raised here. And I'll be damned if I let Brookside stay this way." Dion, sitting in the front row, felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Because for the first time since this nightmare began, he wasn't alone. Retaliation in the dark, the final attack. But Brookside wasn't ready to change without a fight. The night after the meeting, trouble found Dion once again. He was walking home from Jordan's house when he heard it, the low hum of an engine following him. His heart pounded. He picked up his pace. The car sped up. And then, screech. Tires skidded on pavement as the car cut him off, blocking his path. Before he could react, 4 masked figures jumped out. Dion barely had time to lift his arms before they attacked. A punch to the gut. A kick to his ribs. Laughter. Sneering voices. "This is for what you did to Monroe." Dion collapsed, gasping for air. He tasted blood. The last thing he saw before blacking out? A bat raised over his head. And then, darkness. The aftermath, a town forced to choose. Dion woke up in a hospital bed the next morning. His mother was at his side, tears streaking her face. Janelle stood by the door, rage burning in her eyes. And Ryan Monroe? He was sitting in a chair across from Dion, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, Ryan broke the silence. "I know who did this," he said. Lisa stiffened, and Ryan exhaled, his jaw tightening. "I'll testify." The room went silent. Because this was the moment of truth. If Ryan came forward, he would be turning against the very people who had once protected him. He would be painting a target on his own back. But for the first time in his life, he didn't care. Because this time, the right side was clear. And he was choosing it. The climax, justice finally wins. The trial was swift. With Ryan's testimony, the attackers were arrested and convicted. The town that had once wanted to bury Dion Carter had no choice but to acknowledge what had been done to him. And finally, justice had been served. But Dion? He wasn't done. Because justice wasn't just about one conviction. It was about changing the system so no one else had to go through what he did. And with Janelle Parker at his side, That's exactly what he was going to do. The happy ending. A future worth fighting for. Months later, Brookside wasn't the same town it had been before. There were new policies in place to prevent racial profiling. A citizen review board was created to oversee police misconduct. And Dion Carter? He was no longer just the kid who had been falsely accused. He was the young man who had stood up, fought back, and won. He was a symbol of resilience. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid to walk through his own town. The lesson, what we can all learn. Brookside isn't just a town. It's every place where injustice is ignored. It's every system that protects the powerful over the innocent. It's every person who has ever been told their voice doesn't matter. But Dion Carter's story proves something powerful. One voice can make a difference. One act of courage can spark change. And when people stand together, there is nothing that can silence them. What happens next? What do you think? Will Brookside stay on the path of justice? Or will history repeat itself? Would you fight for what's right, even if it meant risking everything? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you believe in standing up for justice. And make sure to follow the channel so you never miss another powerful story. Because this is just the beginning.